I wasn't really going anywhere. That was the thing. Late afternoon. That soft stretch where the light turns a little warmer and everything feels slower, like the day is deciding whether it's done with you yet. I remember thinking the air felt lighter than it had in the morning. Not cooler, just looser, less pressure in it. I'd been riding for a while, no route in mind, just moving, letting the city pass without needing anything from it. Sometimes that's enough. Then the bike started pulling. Not hard, not dangerous, just enough that you notice it if you're paying attention. A quiet tug to the left, the kind of thing you ignore at first. You tell yourself it's the road, or your posture, or nothing at all. But it kept happening. I slowed down. Listen, there's a sound bikes make when something's off. Not loud, more like a complaint. I've learned to stop when I hear that. Things don't usually fix themselves. The shop was right there. Small place. Easy to miss. No bright signs. Just a window with smudges from hands that had leaned there too many times. The door was open. I could hear metal clinking softly. Tools being set down. Picked up again. Inside. It felt still. Not empty. Just quiet in a working way. Like everyone knew what they were doing and didn't need to talk about it. Grease in the corners. Old marks on the floor that never really come out. The smell hit me right away. Oil. Rubber. Something warm underneath it. I didn't announce myself. I never really do. Before I could say anything, one of the mechanics looked up and walked over, calm about it. No rush. No questions yet. He crouched down near the front wheel and put a hand on the frame like he was greeting it. That stuck with me. He didn't start adjusting right away. He listened, leaned in, gave the wheel a slow spin, watched it, like doctors do when they're trying to see past the obvious stuff. I remember thinking how natural it all looked. No show, no hurry, just attention. We talked a little, nothing important. Weather, riding, how some bikes feel different depending on who's been on them. He said that. I liked it, felt true. At the time, it didn't feel like a story. Just a pause in the day. One of those moments you think will end as soon as it starts. He worked without saying much, which I liked. There's a rhythm to it when someone knows what they're doing. Not fast, not slow, just steady. He adjusted the bike the way you might straighten a picture frame that's been bothering you for a while. Small movements. Then he stepped back, looked again, made sure. We talked while he worked. Kinda drifted into it. Nothing you'd quote. He asked how long I'd been riding. I told him a while. He said you can usually tell by how someone treats their bike, whether they listen to it or just expect it to behave. I laughed a little at that. Not loud, just a breath through the nose. He said some bikes age better when they're handled gently. Others need to be pushed or they stiffen up, like people. He didn't say it like a lesson, just an observation. The kind that slips out when you've been around something long enough. The shop stayed quiet around us. Not silent. You could hear tools in the back. A radio murmuring somewhere. The low sound of air moving through a hose. But nobody was paying attention to us, which felt good. Normal. He spotted the problem pretty quickly. A cable just slightly out of line, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He loosened it, adjusted, straightened the wheel, spun it again. This time it moved clean. No pull, no complaint. He smiled then. Just once, not big. Like he was satisfied, more than happy. All right, he said. That should do it. I rolled the bike forward a little. Felt a difference right away. Straight, easy. I reached for my wallet. It was automatic. You fix something for me? I pay you. That's how it works. He shook his head. You're good, he said. Took a minute. I paused. Looked at him to see if he was joking. He wasn't. No tone. No performance. Just a statement. I asked if he was sure. He nodded. Already wiping his hands on a rag. Already moving on. Something about that sat with me. Not because it was generous in a big way, but because it wasn't framed as generosity at all. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't expect anything back. He just helped and kept going. I thanked him anyway. Probably more quietly than I meant to. I started to roll the bike toward the door. I remember noticing the light outside had shifted a little while we were inside, the day leaning further into itself. That's when the air in the shop changed. You can feel it when it happens. A tightening, like someone closed a window you didn't realize was open. A voice came from behind us, controlled, sharp around the edges, practiced, talking about rules, about labor, about decisions that weren't his to make. I stopped walking. The mechanic didn't turn around right away. He just stood there, still holding the rag, listening. The voice kept going. Not loud, not angry. That would have been easier to understand. It was measured instead, tight. The kind of tone that assumes it's right before anyone else gets a chance to speak. I turned around slowly. The manager was standing a little too close to him. Close enough to make it clear who had the space and who didn't. He wasn't looking at me. Not really. His eyes stayed on the mechanic like I wasn't part of the room anymore. He talked about policy, about how you don't give away work, about how it makes the rest of the team look bad. The mechanic didn't interrupt, didn't explain, didn't even shift his weight. He just listened, like he'd done this before, like he already knew where it was headed. I watched his hands while the manager talked, how he folded the rag, unfolded it, folded it again, careful, precise, same way he'd worked on the bike. Then the manager said it. Pack your things. No build-up, no conversation, just the sentence, dropped into the room like it was already decided. Everything stopped. Tools went quiet. The radio kept playing, but no one was listening to it anymore. You could feel everyone in the shop suddenly aware of their own bodies, where to stand, where not to look. The mechanic didn't ask why. He nodded once. That was it. He took off his gloves slowly, one finger at a time. Set them on the counter like he might come back for them later. That's what got me, not the firing itself. The care he took was something he wouldn't need anymore. I asked the manager if that was really happening. My voice sounded strange to me, not shaky, just unfamiliar, like I'd stepped into someone else's sentence. He looked at me then, finally, said yes, said it was policy, said he'd already been warned, said this wasn't up for discussion. I asked how long the mechanic had worked there. He didn't hesitate long enough to know better. The words hung there, heavy, final. That's when something shifted in me. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. I'd seen this before. People getting punished for stepping outside an invisible line, for choosing decency when it wasn't convenient, for helping the wrong person at the wrong time. I looked at the mechanic. He was still standing there, waiting, not pleading, not angry, just present. I asked him if he had family. He hesitated, just a second, then said yes. 2 kids. He said it quietly, like it wasn't something he wanted to use, like he was embarrassed that it mattered. I asked if he had another job lined up. He shook his head. No drama, no self-pity, just the truth. And suddenly, this wasn't about a bike anymore. I stood there longer than I meant to. There was that moment where you feel the pull to leave, where your body starts doing what it always does. You tell yourself it's not your place, that you don't know the full story, that stepping in might make things worse. I felt all of that, every excuse lined up, neat and reasonable. And then I thought about him going home that night, about having to explain something that shouldn't need explaining, about 2 kids watching an adult try to make sense of a day that suddenly collapsed. So I didn't move. I asked the manager if I could pay for the repair. He nodded, already reaching for the register, like this was finally back in a shape he understood. I told him I wanted to pay for the rest of the day too, for the mechanic's time, all of it. He stopped smiling. I said it calmly, no edge to it, like I was asking about the weather. He laughed a little at first. Not unkindly, like I was making a point he didn't need to take seriously. I waited until the laugh faded on its own. Then I told him I wanted to make sure the mechanic was covered for the next few months, long enough to figure out what came next without panic pressing on his chest every morning. The room went quiet in a different way this time. The manager asked what I meant by that. I told him exactly what I meant, that I wasn't here to argue policy, that I wasn't here to tell him how to run his shop. I just wasn't going to let someone fall through the floor because they chose to help me. He looked around the room. Nobody met his eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anything. I just stayed where I was, steady, certain, like I'd already decided and was waiting for the world to catch up. I turned to the mechanic and asked him if he'd ever thought about doing his own thing. Maybe mobile repairs. Maybe teaching someone else what he knew. I could tell he had it in him, the patience, the care. He shrugged, said he'd thought about it, said it always felt like something meant for other people, people with time, with room to fail. I nodded, told him that's usually how it feels right before it isn't. Then I said something that surprised both of us. I told him he wasn't fired, not by me. I told him we were leaving. There was a pause, long enough to feel awkward, long enough for everyone in the room to realize this moment wasn't going to resolve neatly. He looked at the manager once, not defiant, just checking if this was real. The manager didn't say anything. So the mechanic picked up his gloves, hesitated, then put them back down, like he didn't need them anymore. We walked out together. Not fast, not like we were proving something, just two people stepping back into the afternoon. The light had shifted again, longer shadows now, the kind that stretch without asking permission. Outside, he thanked me. I told him he didn't need to. We stood there for a second longer than necessary, neither of us in a rush anymore. It was later that night when it really landed. I was sitting somewhere quiet, don't remember exactly where, one of those places you've been 100 times without noticing. The city was still awake, but softer, distant sounds, a car passing, someone laughing a block away. My coffee had gone cold. I kept forgetting to drink it. I kept thinking about the way he folded that rag, how careful he was with it, like it mattered. A few weeks passed. Life kept moving the way it does. I didn't replay the shop every day. It wasn't like that. Just sometimes it would come back, in pieces, the silence. The look on his face when I said we were leaving, not shock, more like relief, trying to stay contained. Then my phone rang one afternoon. I almost didn't answer it. It was him. He sounded different, lighter, still himself, but steadier. He told me he'd started doing mobile repairs out of his truck. Said it wasn't fancy. Said it was busy, though. More than he expected. People calling him back, telling their friends. He paused for a second before he mentioned his kids. Said they'd stopped asking if everything was okay. Said they just assumed it was now, like that's how things are supposed to feel. I didn't say much. Just listened. After we hung up, I sat there for a while longer. Let the noise of the city fill in the gaps. I thought about how close things get sometimes. How one decision, one afternoon, one person choosing to stay instead of walking away can change the direction of a whole life without announcing itself. It didn't feel heroic. Still doesn't. It felt ordinary, which might be the point. We talk a lot about saving people. Like it has to be dramatic. Like you have to pull someone out of something burning. But most of the time, it's quieter than that. Most of the time, it's just noticing when someone's about to fall and standing close enough that they don't have to